A person is awake at 3 in the morning, lying very still in a dark room, one arm across their face, staring at a ceiling they can barely see. Nothing dramatic is happening, no voice has arrived, no revelation has come, but the mind is asking for something anyway, some sign that the love, the grief, the effort, the losses, the years will add up to something, not certainty, not even proof, just the smallest assurance that the shape of a life is not finally accidental. Hope usually enters there as mercy. It is the word we give to the feeling that the silence will not have the last word. But Albert Camus asks a harder question. What if that mercy is also sometimes the way we stop looking clearly? In 1942, in occupied France, Camus published The Myth of Sisyphus, an essay that begins with the question of whether life is worth living and refuses almost every comforting answer philosophy usually offers. The problem tonight is not how Camus gives us hope, it is whether hope, when it promises final meaning or rescue, becomes one of the last escapes from the absurd. The absurd for Camus is not simply the claim that life has no meaning. It is the collision between our demand for meaning and the world's refusal to answer. We will follow that collision through suicide, philosophical suicide, the leap, revolt, freedom, absurd creation, Kafka, and finally Sisyphus pushing his stone. By the end of tonight, we will have followed Camus to the place he actually arrives. Not a cure for meaninglessness, not a philosophy of happiness, but a position that refuses both suicide and consolation at the same time, and asks whether that refusal might be the only honest answer the situation permits. If you enjoy thinking through questions like this with us, subscribing helps others find them too. Sharing the video helps even more. Let's begin. What is it exactly that we want when we lie awake in the dark and want something? Not certainty, not a clean argument, something between those, a sign that the shape of things has a direction we can feel, even if we cannot prove it. The first mistake is to treat hope as a doctrine before we have treated it as an experience. Most of us do not meet hope in a book. We meet it when the ordinary explanations have gone quiet and the mind keeps reaching anyway. We hope that a loss will one day make sense. We hope that love was not wasted. We hope that the work of staying alive is held somewhere in a pattern larger than what we can see. Let us stay with that moment before we move to Camus, because the whole argument depends on not sneering at the tenderness of hope. The person at 3 in the morning is not stupid, they are not weak, they are not making a childish demand for a universe arranged around them. They are asking for what human beings ask for almost without deciding to ask. That suffering not be mute, that effort not vanish, that death not turn every meaning into a temporary arrangement of words. Think about the last time we held on to a hope we could not quite justify. Not a plan. A plan has steps, dates, probabilities, contingencies. Hope is different. Hope often begins precisely where planning ends. It says that something will come together, though we cannot say how. It says that this darkness is not the whole account. It says, quietly, that the world may still be answerable to us. And already we can feel the danger. The tenderness of hope makes it difficult to question. If someone says they hope a child recovers, or a friendship repairs, or tomorrow is less cruel than today, it would be obscene to answer with philosophy. Ordinary hope belongs to the human fabric of time. We live forward because the next morning has not happened yet. We do not need Camus to police that. But Camus is not interested only in ordinary forward motion. He is interested in the moment hope becomes a metaphysical operation. That happens when hope stops meaning, perhaps tomorrow will be better, and starts meaning, somewhere the whole thing is justified. The word stays the same, the structure changes. One hope waits for a future event, the other asks reality itself to carry a hidden promise. We know both versions from the inside. We can hope that a conversation goes well, and we can also hope that everything painful will one day be shown to have been necessary. One is practical, the other is cosmic. One lives inside uncertainty, the other tries to make uncertainty tolerable by imagining an answer behind it. Camus's suspicion begins there. So the night question is not whether hope feels good. Of course it does. The question is what hope is doing when it enters the room. Is it helping us remain awake to what is real, or is it placing a veil over the place where reality refuses us? Is it endurance, or is it escape? This distinction matters because the standard reading of Camus usually arrives too quickly. We are told that he looks at meaninglessness and answers with courage, rebellion, sunshine, sensuality, or a kind of existential joy. Some of that language comes from somewhere real in his work, but it is too smooth. It lets us imagine that Camus simply removes old meaning and replaces it with a more modern meaning called freedom. That is not the pressure of the Myth of Sisyphus. The book is harsher and more exacting than that. Camus does not ask us to decorate the absence of final meaning with personal projects and call it solved. He asks what happens if we refuse to lie about the absence and also refuse to let it destroy us. That is a narrower path, and it begins with the want we have just named. We want our lives to add up to something. We want the dead to have been carried somewhere. We want what we endured to be more than endurance. We want the universe, or history, or God, or truth, or time itself to become the accountant of our pain. We rarely put it so directly. But the demand is there. Camus does not begin by answering that demand. He begins by asking whether the demand has met a world capable of answering it. And once that question is asked honestly, the tenderness of hope becomes philosophically dangerous, not because hope is ugly, but because it is beautiful enough to make evasion feel like fidelity. So before Camus appears as a name, the problem is already alive. We are awake in the dark. We want a sign. We want the shape of things to explain itself. And the ceiling, the night, the world, gives back nothing we can call an answer. Camus's entire argument begins at that silence. He does not begin with a consolation for that silence. He begins with a question most philosophers try to soften before they ask it. There is another reason to begin here, rather than with biography. Camus's life matters, but the listener's first contact with the argument should not be a date, a school, or a label. The problem is older than the name Camus and more intimate than the category absurdism. We meet it whenever the world seems to owe us an answer and does not pay. Once that experience is alive, Camus is no longer an author being introduced. He is the person who refuses to look away from what the experience exposes. Hope also has a grammar we rarely notice. It points forward, but often borrows authority from beyond the future. It says not only that something may happen, but that what happens will reveal a hidden order. That is why hope can feel both gentle and demanding. It comforts us by promising that the story is still underway, and it pressures the world to become the kind of story in which the pain we have known can be gathered back into meaning. This is where the night register matters. At noon, many of us can speak fluently about uncertainty. We can accept that life has no guaranteed plot. We can sound almost Camusian in conversation. But at night, when the distractions fall away, the demand becomes less abstract. We do not ask whether the universe contains teleology. We ask whether this particular grief, this particular love, this particular effort is held anywhere beyond our own memory of it. Camus's value is that he does not shame that demand. He lets it stand. The absurd is not born from a petty complaint that life is inconvenient. It is born from a noble human hunger meeting a world that offers no final meal. If the hunger were trivial, the absurd would be trivial. If the silence were easily dismissed, hope would not be so tempting. The whole argument depends on both sides being taken seriously. The important thing is that the hope in this room is not an argument yet. It is a pressure. Philosophy often fails when it starts by translating pressures too quickly into positions. Camus does something better. He lets the pressure become visible first, and then asks which arguments are tempted to serve it. That order matters. If we start with doctrine, hope becomes an object to approve or condemn. If we start with the room at 3 a.m, hope becomes a human fact that can still be questioned without being mocked. We can also see why cheap anti-hope language fails. To say hope is only illusion would be emotionally false and philosophically lazy. Hope helps people endure real nights. It keeps care directed toward the future. It protects action from premature collapse. Camus's question is narrower and more disturbing, not whether hope is useful, but whether usefulness becomes a reason to let hope perform metaphysical work it has not earned. What is the most honest question philosophy can ask? Not what is real, not how should we act, not what can we know. Camus proposes something simpler and more uncomfortable: whether life is worth living. This is the line that makes the myth of Sisyphus feel dangerous even before the argument begins. Camus opens by saying there is only one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. We have to be careful here. He is not writing a clinical manual. He is not offering personal advice. He is taking a question that usually appears at the edge of crisis and asking what it reveals about philosophy itself. We tend to treat the question of whether life is worth living as something that belongs outside philosophy, as a symptom, an emergency, a breakdown. Camus insists it is also a philosophical test. If a system can explain being, knowledge, morality, history, and God, but cannot say why existence should be continued once its supports collapse, then for Camus the system has avoided the hardest point. Let us read the move carefully. He is not asking whether life is pleasant. He is not asking whether life contains beauty. He is asking whether the fact of living has a justification strong enough to survive the loss of final meaning. Habit can carry us for a long time. Love can carry us. Work can carry us. But Camus wants to know what happens when the mind notices that carrying is not the same as answering. We do not usually ask ourselves why we are continuing. We continue. We wake, eat, speak, answer messages, make coffee, meet obligations, postpone decisions, repair small damages, and move through days with a kind of practical faith in tomorrow. Most of life depends on not interrupting itself with the question of life. Camus interrupts it. That interruption is not melodrama. It is a demand for seriousness. If philosophy is going to speak about meaning, it has to face the case where meaning fails to appear. If it is going to speak about truth, it has to face the truth that many of our reasons for living are not reasons in the strict sense. They are attachments, habits, bodies, memories, faces, obligations, weather, hunger, tenderness, and these matter. Camus is not contemptuous of them, but he wants to know whether they are enough once the world has lost the aura of final explanation. The question is not whether a person has motives to continue. The question is whether those motives answer the demand for meaning, or whether they simply continue alongside the unanswered demand. Here the word absurd begins to appear, but not yet as a slogan. In ordinary speech, absurd means ridiculous, strange, out of proportion. For Camus it becomes more precise. The absurd is born when the human need for clarity, unity, and reason meets a world that does not give those things back. It is not just the world, it is not just the mind, it is the meeting. This matters because suicide, in Camus's argument, is not a solution to the absurd. It ends the life that experiences the contradiction. It removes the questioner, but it does not answer the question. If the absurd is the relation between a demanding mind and a silent world, then physical self-destruction abolishes the relation by abolishing one side of it. Camus refuses that as an answer. Again, we have to keep the register clear. This is a philosophical account of the argument inside the myth of Sisyphus, not guidance for anyone in crisis. Camus is asking what follows from absurd reasoning. He is asking whether the logical consequence of a world without final answer is the rejection of life. His answer is no, but that no does not yet mean hope. This is where many simplified readings move too fast. They hear Camus reject suicide and assume he has affirmed life in some familiar, reassuring sense. But a refusal to die is not the same thing as a proof that life is meaningful. Camus knows this. The hard part of his argument is that he refuses the destructive exit without replacing it with a metaphysical guarantee. So the suicide question becomes the doorway into a more precise problem. If ending life is not an answer, what about changing the terms of the question? What about preserving life by deciding that the silence is not really silence after all? What about finding, beyond reason, a promise that the world will eventually answer? That is where hope begins to acquire its dangerous shape. Not hope as tomorrow's breakfast, or the recovery of someone we love, or the small courage of making plans. Hope as a claim that the contradiction will be reconciled somewhere, somehow, by something beyond what the absurd itself allows us to know. Camus has not yet made that accusation. First, he has to define the absurd more exactly, because unless we understand the absurd as a relation, we will misunderstand everything else. We will think he is saying life is meaningless. He is saying something more difficult. The opening of the Myth of Sisyphus is shocking because it refuses the usual hierarchy of philosophical problems. Metaphysics can wait. Epistemology can wait. Even ethics, in the formal sense, can wait. First comes the question of continuation. If life cannot be shown livable under the truth philosophy discovers, then philosophy has become ornamental. It may be clever, but it has not yet touched the pressure point where thought and existence meet. This also explains why Camus' question is not morbid curiosity. A morbid treatment would linger on death as image or spectacle. Camus does something colder and more serious. He asks what judgment is being made when someone concludes life is not worth living. The philosophical weight is in the judgment, not the scene. That distinction is essential for keeping the script responsible and source-led. The question of suicide also exposes the insufficiency of mere explanation. Science can explain causes. History can explain circumstances. Psychology can explain states of mind. These explanations matter, but Camus is asking a different question: whether explanation becomes justification. A chain of causes can tell us how a life arrived at a point. It cannot by itself tell us why life should continue after final meaning has failed to appear. So when Camus refuses suicide, he is not offering a sentimental defense of existence. He is preserving the possibility of an absurd answer. The absurd cannot be lived if the living subject disappears. The question cannot be followed if the questioner is gone. His no is methodological before it is consoling. It keeps the investigation open at the moment when one possible conclusion would close it forever. There is a hidden discipline in refusing to answer too soon. Camus does not move from the suicide question to a ready-made doctrine of courage. He lets the scandal of the question remain. The fact that life usually continues does not settle whether life is justified. The fact that many people love life does not settle whether love answers the absurd. The fact that beauty exists does not settle whether beauty can carry metaphysical weight. Each of these may matter later, but none is allowed to close the question at the start. The suicide question also forces philosophy to give up ornamental seriousness. A thought can sound profound while never risking anything. Camus wants a thought that can stand beside the question of continuation. If it cannot, it may be interesting, but it is not yet serious in his sense. This is why the book feels so stark. It begins where abstraction loses the privilege of remaining untouched by life. There is also a reason Camus begins with an either-or that later becomes more complicated. At the start, the question is whether to live, but as the argument develops, the deeper question becomes how to live without falsifying the reason for continuing. A person can remain alive and still abandon the absurd through consolation. That is why the suicide question opens the book but does not exhaust it. The book is not only about staying alive, it is about what kind of staying remains honest. If the absurd is not a property of the universe, not something sitting out there in the silence, then what exactly is it? Where does it live? The common version says Camus believes life is meaningless. That is not completely unrelated to the argument, but it is too crude to carry the weight. In the Myth of Sisyphus, the absurd is not a conclusion we discover in the world like a stone underfoot. It is a confrontation. It happens when one thing asks and another does not answer. On one side is the human demand. We want the world to be intelligible. We want suffering to have proportion. We want the death of someone loved not to vanish into the same silence as a broken cup. We want unity, clarity, explanation, a reason why this happened rather than that. We may be sophisticated enough to deny this in daylight, but in the dark the demand returns. On the other side is the world, not a cruel world, not a mocking world, a silent one. The world does not refuse to explain in the way a person refuses. It does not know we have asked. It gives weather, accident, illness, beauty, loss, chance, and time. We ask for meaning, and what comes back is event. The absurd is the gap between those facts. We are the ones who ask. The world is the one that does not answer. Neither side alone is enough. If there were no human longing for meaning, there would be no absurd. If the world supplied final meaning clearly, there would be no absurd. The absurd lives in the collision. And let us be precise about what this changes. If the absurd were simply a fact about the universe, we might be able to state it and move on. Life is meaningless, now do this. But Camus's absurd is unstable. It has to be maintained. It depends on keeping both terms present, the demand and the silence. Let one disappear, and the absurd disappears with it. And this matters directly for the question we arrived with, because if the absurd is a confrontation, then softening the confrontation with hope is not a solution. It is a retreat. Hope becomes suspect whenever it changes the silence into a hidden answer, or changes our demand into something that no longer has to face the silence. Imagine removing the human side of the absurd. Imagine we stopped wanting the world to make sense, not because we had made peace with reality, but because the desire for meaning had gone numb. Would the absurd survive? Camus says no. There would be no confrontation left, only a creature moving through events without asking them to mean anything. That might be anesthesia. It is not lucidity. Now imagine removing the world's silence. Imagine we discover a final code behind suffering, a total explanation in which every loss has its place and every wound is justified by the whole. The absurd disappears there too, but it disappears because the world has become answerable. It has become the thing we wanted it to be. That is the dream many hopes carry. Camus' discipline is to refuse both removals. He will not numb the human demand, because the demand is part of our dignity, but he will not pretend the world answers it. The absurd, then, is not a doctrine we believe. It is a tension we live. It is a clear relationship with the world that does not complete the relationship. This is why Camus' language of divorce and estrangement matters. A divorce is not one person alone. It is a broken relation. Something that seemed joined is now revealed as separate. Human consciousness wants intimacy with the world. It wants the world to speak the same language. The absurd is the moment we discover the languages do not match. We can feel this without technical vocabulary. We ask why someone died when they did. The world gives medical causes, perhaps, but not meaning. We ask why effort fails and accident succeeds. The world gives sequences, not justice. We ask whether love survives death. The world gives memory and decay. The answer may be emotionally rich. It is not final. So when Camus speaks of the absurd, he is not inviting us into nihilism as a mood. He is asking us to notice the exact structure of an experience we already know. We have asked for reasons. We have received facts. We have asked for finality. We have received time. We have asked for a voice. We have received silence. Here is where hope begins to press on the argument. Hope often tells us that the silence is temporary. Not always in crude religious language, though sometimes that too. It says the answer exists beyond the present horizon, beyond death, beyond reason, beyond history, beyond the visible surface of events. It keeps the human demand alive by imagining the world will eventually meet it. Camus does not deny the emotional power of that. He denies that absurd reasoning permits it. If the absurd is what we have when demand and silence confront one another, then any move that turns silence into delayed speech has ended the absurd. The confrontation may feel resolved, but for Camus it has not been answered. It has been escaped. So here is where we stand. We arrived with a 3 in the morning want, a hope that suffering will add up, and we now have a philosophical structure for what that want runs into. The absurd is not a doctrine about an empty universe. It is the collision between our demand for meaning and the world's refusal to supply one. What we have to face now is the most natural human response to that collision, and why Camus thinks it is also the most tempting way to stop confronting it. The relational structure also guards against a second simplification. The idea that Camus is simply projecting human need onto an indifferent universe, and then complaining that the universe does not comply. He knows the demand is human, that is the point. The absurd is not a mistake made by expecting the world to behave like a person. It is the clear awareness that we cannot stop being creatures who ask, even when we know the world is not built to answer. That awareness is different from resignation. Resignation often lowers the demand until it stops hurting. Camus does not want the demand lowered. He wants it seen. The human longing for unity, clarity, and reason remains part of the situation. If we pretend not to want meaning, we have not become lucid. We have merely amputated one half of the absurd and called the numbness wisdom. The world's silence must also be kept clean. It is tempting to turn silence into hostility, as if the universe were cruelly withholding meaning. But cruelty would already be a kind of relation. A cruel world notices us. A mocking world answers in a distorted voice. Camus's silence is more disturbing because it is not personal. The world does not answer because answering is not what the world does. This is why the image of the ceiling in the opening matters. The ceiling is not against the person staring at it. It is just there, flat, mute, ordinary, almost embarrassingly inadequate to the size of the question being projected onto it. The absurd often arrives through that disproportion, a vast human demand meeting something that is not dramatic enough to be an opponent. Once the absurd is understood as relation, even the language of meaninglessness has to be handled carefully. Meaninglessness sounds like a property, as if we inspected the universe and found no meaning stamped into it. Camus is subtler. The universe may contain order, law, beauty, complexity, and life. What it does not contain, at least not in the form our demand seeks, is a final answer addressed to us. The absence is relational. It is the absence of reply. This relational account also explains why Camus can reject both nihilism and consolation. Nihilism tends to let the silence swallow the demand. Consolation tends to let the demand invent an answer to silence. The absurd keeps both. It keeps the human cry and the world's non-reply in the same frame. That frame is painful, but it is the only place Camus thinks honesty can begin. The silence of the world can also be mistaken for a theory. Camus is not proving that no meaning exists in any possible sense. He is describing the situation available to absurd reasoning. The mind demands final clarity, and the world does not provide it. That modesty is important. The argument is strong because it does not need omniscience. It only needs the gap between what we seek and what experience gives. When a question becomes too painful, we usually find a way out. But what if every way out costs something we cannot get back? Camus names one exit immediately: physical suicide. Again, he treats it as a philosophical test, not as advice, and not as a spectacle. If the absurd is unbearable, one way to end the confrontation is to end the life in which the confrontation appears. Camus refuses this, not because he has already found meaning, but because ending the questioner does not answer the question. Let us follow the logic carefully. The absurd exists only while the human demand and the world's silence are held together. Physical suicide destroys the side that asks. It is a confession that the absurd has won by force. It accepts that life cannot be lived under these conditions. For Camus, that is not an absurd victory. It is a surrender to the very contradiction the argument is trying to understand. We usually want a gentler reason. We want him to say life is beautiful, so continue. Sometimes he does say things that sound close to that, especially when he writes about sun, sea, bodies, and the immediacy of experience. But in this argument, the refusal comes before any consolation. It is a refusal to let the absurd dictate death as its conclusion. That leaves another exit, and this one is more subtle. Suppose we keep living, but we change the meaning of the silence. Suppose we decide that the silence points beyond itself, that its very refusal is a sign of something higher, that reason fails because something more than reason is required. We have not killed the body, we have killed the confrontation. Camus calls this philosophical suicide. The phrase can sound theatrical, but the idea is exact. Physical suicide ends the life that feels the absurd. Philosophical suicide ends the lucidity that sees the absurd. It preserves breathing, loving, speaking, building, praying, writing. But it sacrifices the clear relation to what the argument has established. We have all done a small version of this with some difficult question, set it aside, told ourselves it was not useful to keep asking, let a phrase replace an answer. The question remained, but we stopped carrying it. Camus is not interested in scolding this ordinary human movement. He is asking what happens when philosophy itself makes that movement and calls it truth. This is why the second exit matters more than the first for the question of hope. Physical suicide is obviously an ending. Philosophical suicide can look like courage. It can look like wisdom, faith, depth, humility before mystery. It can even look more serious than Camus, because it refuses the arrogance of human reason and opens itself to transcendence. But Camus's standard is not emotional nobility. His standard is fidelity to the absurd. Did the argument establish a transcendent answer? No. Did it establish that the silence is meaningful? No. Did it establish that reason's failure is evidence of something higher than reason? No. Then to make that move is to leap beyond the evidence of the absurd itself. This is where hope changes register. Hope is no longer simply the tenderness of wishing tomorrow better. It becomes the claim that the contradiction will be redeemed somewhere outside the contradiction. It becomes appeal. It asks a higher court to reverse the silence of the world. Camus's phrase "without appeal" will matter later, because appeal is exactly what this exit preserves. We treat the question of why to continue as temporary, something for hard nights, not permanent philosophy. Camus says that if we have been honest with the question once, we cannot fully put it down. It stays. And the temptation is not only to end life. The temptation is to keep life while making the question less sharp. So the two exits are not symmetrical, but they rhyme. One removes the person who demands meaning. The other removes the clear sight by which the demand meets silence. Both end the absurd by removing one of its terms. Both give relief, and both, for Camus, fail the test. This is a severe claim. It means that much of what human beings call comfort may be philosophically suspect. It means that a beautiful answer can be a way of not answering. It means the mind can survive the absurd by betraying the very clarity that made the absurd visible. Camus rejects suicide as concession. But now he has to reckon with something that looks very different from suicide. Something that looks like wisdom, courage, and faith. He calls it philosophical suicide, and the thinkers who practice it are serious philosophers, not cowards. The phrase philosophical suicide can sound aggressive, but Camus needs a word strong enough to mark the seriousness of the betrayal. The person who leaps has not stopped thinking. They may have thought more deeply than the skeptic. They may have carried contradiction further than the comfortable rationalist ever would. The suicide, for Camus, occurs not at the beginning of the thought, but at the end, when the conclusion no longer follows from the premises the thinker has established. This makes the critique more respectful and more severe at the same time. If Kierkegaard or Chestov were merely irrational, Camus could dismiss them. Instead, he has to say something harder. They are powerful precisely because they begin where he begins. They know the wound. They understand the failure of ordinary reason. Their leap is not an irrelevant religious addition. It is a rival answer to the same pressure. And this rivalry matters for hope. Hope is not standing outside philosophy as a private comfort. In these thinkers, hope enters as a philosophical act. It interprets the limit of reason. It says, the boundary is not a wall but an invitation. It gives the absurd a direction. Camus's refusal is aimed at that interpretation, not at the emotional need that makes it attractive. The two exits show what the rest of the argument must preserve. It must preserve life against physical suicide. It must preserve lucidity against philosophical suicide. It has to say yes to continuing and no to final consolation in the same breath. That double movement is the beginning of revolt, though Camus has not fully named it yet. This is why Camus's refusal of both exits has to be heard as one movement, not two separate opinions. He is not first anti-suicide and then anti-faith in a casual sequence. He is defending the confrontation itself. Anything that ends the confrontation before it has been lived honestly is suspect. Death ends it by force. The leap ends it by interpretation. Both may feel like release. Neither preserves the absurd as Camus has defined it. The phrase "way out" is important because it can describe movements that feel morally opposite. Despair and consolation may look like enemies, but both can release us from the sustained pressure of the absurd. One says the pressure makes life impossible. The other says the pressure is already solved somewhere beyond our sight. Camus refuses both releases because both make the confrontation disappear before it has been lived. What if the most honest thing we could do with an unbearable contradiction was to let it break open into something larger? Is that courage, or is that flight? Camus's argument is often flattened into a secular thinker dismissing religion. That is too easy. The philosophers he criticizes are not fools. Kierkegaard is not a cartoon believer. Chestov is not a lazy mystic. Jaspers is not simply confused. Camus sees in them a genuine encounter with the limit of reason. His charge is not that they never reach the absurd. It is that, having reached it, they leap. Let us follow what the leap means. It is not a physical action, and it is not merely deciding to believe something cheerful. The leap is the move from the world's silence to a meaning beyond the world's silence. It says, in different forms, that reason's failure is not the end, it is a doorway. The contradiction becomes evidence that we must pass beyond ordinary evidence. In Kierkegaard, Camus sees a thinker who understands anguish, paradox, and the scandal of existence with extraordinary force. Kierkegaard does not smooth the contradiction, he sharpens it. But then the contradiction becomes the very place where faith enters. The absurd is not simply endured. It becomes, in a strange reversal, the path toward God. For Camus, that reversal is the problem. Chestov makes a different music with the same structure. He rejects the tyranny of reason and necessity. He wants the impossible to remain possible because God is not bound by the rational order that crushes human hope. Camus understands the appeal. Who would not want necessity broken? Who would not want the last word taken away from death, logic, and fate? But again, the absurd is transformed into a reason to expect more than the absurd shows. Jaspers, in Camus's reading, takes limit situations, suffering, death, struggle, guilt, and turns them toward transcendence. The boundary where ordinary knowledge fails becomes a sign of what exceeds knowledge. This is subtler than consolation. It is not a childish promise. It is a serious philosophical movement. And that is precisely why Camus has to refuse it carefully. Each of these leaps has a different color, but they make the same move. They ask the absurd to resolve itself into something that justifies the silence. That is the structure of hope Camus is tracking. Not hope as a pleasant feeling, hope as the insistence that the contradiction is not final because something beyond it will make it whole. Imagine we are at the edge of an argument we cannot resolve. We have followed it honestly, and it has led us somewhere we cannot accept. A world with no final justification, no ultimate explanation, no guarantee that suffering is heard. Now imagine we could believe, past the argument's limit, that the answer exists even if we cannot reach it. We would keep our lives. We would keep our sense that things matter. What we would lose is the argument. Camus asks whether that is a fair trade. He does not deny that the leap may be lived with sincerity. He does not deny that faith may have its own internal power. He does not even reduce it to fear. His accusation is narrower and sharper. If absurd reasoning has brought us to the confrontation between demand and silence, then the leap abandons absurd reasoning at the moment when it becomes hardest to bear. We know this structure even outside religion. We turn a grief into a sign. We turn a loss into a lesson. We turn a closed door into proof that another path was meant for us. Sometimes this helps us live. Sometimes it may even be morally beautiful. But Camus would ask, what has happened to the silence? Did it remain silence, or did we quietly teach it to speak? This is why hope can be so difficult to examine honestly. The leap is not always crude. It does not always say, everything happens for a reason, in the shallow tone we know to distrust. It may say that the very failure of reason points beyond reason. It may say that the wound is meaningful precisely because it cannot be understood. It may sound profound. It may be profound. Camus still refuses it. The refusal is not atheism as a mood. It is a methodological austerity. Camus wants to know what follows if we do not move beyond what the absurd gives us. The absurd gives us demand and silence. It gives us consciousness of the mismatch. It gives us the ache for unity and the world's opacity. It does not give us permission to turn opacity into promise, and here the word hope becomes almost unbearable. Because the hope Camus criticizes is often the hope that makes suffering survivable. It is the hope that says no pain is wasted, no love is finally lost, no injustice will remain unreconciled. We can feel why human beings reach for it. Camus can feel it too. That is why his refusal has weight. If he were only mocking consolation, the argument would be small. But he is doing something more difficult. He is asking whether a consolation can be noble and still false to the situation, whether faith can be courageous and still an escape, whether hope can preserve the person and betray lucidity at the same time. What Camus has done is locate hope precisely, not in optimism, not in laziness, but in the most serious philosophical gesture of the existential tradition. The next step is to see what hope actually takes away when it makes that move. Kierkegaard is the hardest case because his leap is not shallow optimism. It is not the claim that everything is pleasant if we look at it correctly. It passes through dread, paradox, and the offense of faith. In that sense, Camus meets a thinker who understands that reason reaches a boundary. The disagreement is over what the boundary authorizes. Kierkegaard sees the possibility of faith. Camus sees an abandonment of the absurd. Chestov sharpens another aspect of the disagreement. He wants freedom from necessity itself. The laws that bind suffering to consequence, death to finality, and reason to impossibility are exactly the laws hope wants broken. We can understand why. There are moments when necessity feels obscene. The heart wants the impossible not as luxury but as justice. Camus's severity lies in saying that the wish for broken necessity still cannot become evidence. Jasper's matters because his version is less obviously doctrinal. Limit situations do not simply point to a dogma, they press the person toward transcendence through the experience of boundary. This is closer to how many modern people hope. Not with a creed, but with a feeling that the very edge of intelligibility suggests something beyond it. Camus sees the appeal and refuses the inference, so the leap is not one doctrine, it is a family of movements. Whenever the failure of reason becomes a reason to believe in what reason cannot establish, the leap has occurred. Whenever silence becomes the sign of a hidden voice, the leap has occurred. Whenever the absurd is asked to testify against itself and in favor of transcendence, Camus hears philosophical suicide. The fairness of Camus's criticism can be debated. A Kierkegaardian might say Camus misunderstands faith by treating it as an illicit conclusion rather than an existential relation. A religious thinker might say reason's limit is precisely where another mode of truth begins. Camus knows there are replies, but his book is not trying to settle theology. It is trying to hold absurd reasoning to its own rule. Do not go beyond what the confrontation gives. The leap also reveals something about human dignity. We do not leap only because we are frightened. We leap because the demand for meaning is one of the deepest signs of our seriousness. We want suffering to be answerable because suffering matters. We want death not to be final because love matters. The leap honors these wants by giving them a metaphysical home. Camus honors them differently, by refusing to let their depth become proof. In this sense, the leap is not an irrational mistake, but a different loyalty. Kierkegaard is loyal to faith, Chestov to the impossible, jaspers to transcendence at the boundary. Camus is loyal to the absurd. The conflict is not between serious thought and unserious belief. It is between different accounts of what fidelity requires after reason reaches its limit. That is why the disagreement remains alive. The leap is attractive because it gives suffering a grammar. Once there is transcendence, pain can become trial, absence can become test, contradiction can become mystery. These words may be meaningful within faith. Camus' objection is that absurd reasoning cannot generate them without exceeding itself. The danger is not vocabulary alone. The danger is that vocabulary changes what the silence is allowed to mean. What if seeing clearly is not just a virtue but a kind of fidelity, a refusal to let what we know be softened by what we wish were true? The easiest critique of hope is psychological. Hope is naive. Hope is wishful thinking. Hope is weakness. Camus is not making that critique. The thinkers he criticizes are not naive, and the hopes he suspects are not always cheap. His objection is structural. When hope functions as appeal, it changes the shape of the absurd. It removes lucidity. Lucidity is one of the quiet center words in this argument. It does not mean intelligence. A person can be intelligent and evasive. It does not mean cynicism. A person can be cynical and still hide from what matters. Lucidity means sustained, clear seeing. It is the refusal to look away from what the absurd has shown, even when the mind is tempted to soften the view. Let us trace what the argument looks like before and after the leap. Before the leap, the human being wants meaning, and the world is silent. The confrontation is painful, but it is clear. After the leap, the silence has become a sign, a test, a doorway, or a hidden promise. The pain may remain, but the philosophical situation has changed. The world is no longer simply silent. It is secretly meaningful. That is what hope removes. It does not necessarily remove suffering. It may not remove grief, anxiety, mortality, or contradiction. What it removes is the nakedness of the confrontation. It covers the silence with a future answer. It allows the mind to say, I do not know the meaning now, but meaning is there. And for Camus, that is already an appeal. We recognize this. The argument is already there. We just do not follow it to the end. We protect ourselves from certain conclusions because they would require us to remake too much. That protection is human. Camus does not call it weakness. He calls it the leap, and he says it has a cost. The cost is not only intellectual consistency, it is the very condition of revolt. Revolt, for Camus, requires the absurd to remain present. If the contradiction is solved by transcendence, revolt loses its object. We no longer stand before a silent world saying no to both destruction and consolation. We stand before a hidden order, waiting for its meaning to appear. That waiting changes everything. Hope turns the present into a corridor. The real life is not quite here. It is ahead, beyond, after, elsewhere. The wound will be explained later. The injustice will be repaired later. The labor will be counted later. The absurd life, by contrast, has to take place here, under the pressure of no later court of appeal. This is why Camus's freedom is severe. If there is no final meaning waiting to judge or redeem our lives, then we are released from certain illusions, but not into comfort. We are released into the present without metaphysical guarantee. The future no longer arrives as salvation, it arrives as time. That can feel like freedom. It can also feel like exposure. Hope, as appeal, reduces that exposure. It gives the present a hidden backing. It says that what cannot be justified now may be justified eventually. Camus's question is not whether that is emotionally useful. It is whether absurd reasoning permits us to say it. If it does not, then the usefulness itself becomes dangerous. It helps us live by asking us to see less. And the difficulty is that seeing less can feel like kindness. We do this with people we love. We soften the truth. We give the gentler version. We let silence become implication because naked silence feels cruel. Camus' argument has an almost inhuman honesty at this point. It asks whether the kindness we extend to ourselves may be exactly where philosophy begins to fail, but he is not asking us to become machines. Lucidity is not the absence of feeling. It may be the hardest form of feeling because it refuses the feeling's demand to become proof. We can grieve without deciding that grief has cosmic meaning. We can love without deciding love is guaranteed by the structure of reality. We can continue without deciding continuation has been endorsed from above. This is a delicate point. If we say Camus rejects hope, full stop, we make him crueler and simpler than he is. If we say he only rejects bad hope, we make him safer than he is. The stronger formulation is this: Camus rejects hope when hope asks the absurd to stop being absurd. He rejects the appeal that turns confrontation into reassurance. So here is where we stand. The absurd is a confrontation, and both exits, physical and philosophical, end the confrontation by removing one of its terms. Physical suicide removes the person who demands meaning. Philosophical suicide removes the lucidity that keeps the demand honest. What we have established is that hope, when it functions as a leap beyond what the absurd permits, is another form of that second exit. What remains open is the question Camus has not yet answered. If both exits are refused, what does the person who stays in the confrontation actually do? That is the question Camus now has to answer. Camus's answer begins with a phrase that sounds bleak until we hear how much it leaves open. Lucidity also has a temporal cost. Hope as appeal often reorganizes time by making the present provisional. The meaning is not here but later. The wound is not explained now, but eventually. The injustice is not answered in history, but beyond history. The present becomes a waiting room for a meaning that has not yet arrived. Camus's absurd person has to live without turning the present into that waiting room. This is why freedom and exposure arrive together. Remove final appeal, and some burdens fall away. We are no longer measuring every act against an invisible cosmic ledger, but other burdens increase. Nothing outside the life will come to certify that the life was rightly spent. Nothing beyond the world will guarantee that love was not lost in vain. We gain room to move and lose the court that would have justified the movement. Camus's position is not psychologically gentle. It asks whether we can bear an unendorsed life, not an empty life, not a loveless life, not a life without beauty, but a life whose beauty does not prove anything beyond itself. That may be the most difficult form of acceptance, to let finite goods remain finite and still let them matter. Hope removes this difficulty by converting finite goods into signs. Love becomes evidence that love is eternal. Moral outrage becomes evidence that justice must prevail somewhere. Beauty becomes evidence that the world is secretly ordered toward meaning. Camus does not deny the power of these conversions. He denies their right to call themselves absurd lucidity. The severity here is easy to misread as contempt for human weakness. A better reading is that Camus is protecting the word honest. If we are going to say we live with the absurd, then we cannot also quietly arrange for the absurd to be redeemed off-stage. The stage is all we have. The off-stage answer is precisely the appeal he refuses. A useful test is to ask what happens to the silence after hope enters. If the silence remains silence and we continue anyway, we are near Camus. If the silence becomes a coded message, a deferred answer, or a proof that some greater meaning must exist, because otherwise the pain would be unbearable, then hope has crossed into appeal. The feeling may be understandable. The crossing is what Camus wants us to see. Lucidity is especially hard because it offers no emotional guarantee. Seeing clearly may not make us calmer. It may make us more exposed. It may increase grief by removing the stories that once absorbed it. Camus does not promise that lucidity feels better. He treats it as a demand of honesty, not a technique for relief. That difference separates his argument from almost every modern use of him as comfort. There is an ethical temptation hidden here too. If we believe all suffering will be reconciled, we may bear it more easily, but we may also become less honest about its scandal. Camus's lucidity keeps scandal scandalous. It does not allow the wound to be absorbed too quickly into a total design. That may be one reason his refusal feels morally serious, even when it feels emotionally severe. What would it mean to live in full view of a silence that will not answer, not by forgetting the silence, not by filling it, but by remaining present to it? The phrase is without appeal. It can sound like a verdict handed down after a trial. No appeal, no higher court, no final reversal. But in Camus, the phrase is not only legal or bleak, it names the condition of absurd life. To live without appeal is to refuse any final justification, rescue, transcendent meaning, or hidden reconciliation that would dissolve the absurd. This does not mean living without love, work, pleasure, memory, loyalty, or ordinary expectation. It does not mean refusing the future in every practical sense. It means refusing to let any of those things become proof that the world is finally justified. We can love without appeal. We can work without appeal. We can continue without appeal. The difficulty is that we usually want these activities to mean more than themselves. Let us trace what without appeal rules out. It rules out the idea that suffering will be redeemed by a final plan. It rules out the idea that death is defeated by a hidden metaphysical continuity. It rules out the idea that history bends, secretly or necessarily, toward moral compensation. It rules out the thought that if we wait long enough, the absurd will turn out to have been a misunderstanding. And yet it does not rule out living. That is the point. Camus wants a life that neither collapses into suicide nor escapes into consolation. The name he gives to this posture is revolt. Not political revolution in this book, though later Camus will develop revolt in a broader moral direction. Here revolt is the sustained refusal of both exits. It says no to death as answer, and no to hope as appeal. We know griefs that do not resolve. Not every wound moves through stages toward acceptance. Some things remain. Some losses do not become lessons. Some silences do not soften into wisdom. Camus is asking whether staying with that, without demanding its conversion into meaning, might be the most honest response available. Imagine we knew with complete certainty that no future event would make sense of the suffering already experienced. No final justification, no eventual compensation, not because things will necessarily get worse, but because the question of justification is permanently open. Could we continue? And if we could, would that continuation require hope, or would it require something different? Camus's answer is revolt, freedom, and passion. These words can mislead if we hear them too warmly. Revolt is not a motivational refusal to give up. Freedom is not cheerful self-invention. Passion is not lifestyle intensity. All three depend on the absence of appeal. They are what remains when the person continues without pretending the silence has changed. Revolt keeps the contradiction alive. It is consciousness held at the point of tension. The absurd person does not say the world has meaning after all. They also do not say nothing matters, so anything goes. They live against the contradiction, with eyes open, refusing the false peace of either collapse or reconciliation. Freedom comes from the collapse of final accounting. If there is no ultimate purpose assigned from beyond life, then no future salvation can organize the present. This frees the absurd person from certain kinds of expectation. But it is not the freedom of getting whatever one wants. It is the freedom of not being measured by a meaning that never arrived. Passion means the intensity of lived experience without appeal to its eternal value. Camus often writes as someone deeply attached to bodily immediacy, sun, sea, touch, movement, theatre, the visible world. But we should not confuse this with a simple philosophy of pleasure. The passion matters because it refuses postponement. It does not wait for life to be justified later before inhabiting it now. We rarely think of freedom as something that depends on uncertainty remaining. But Camus proposes exactly that. The freedom that comes from knowing the situation is permanent has a different texture than the freedom that comes from believing it will pass. One says, "Wait, rescue is coming." The other says, "No rescue is coming, and the present is no longer a waiting room." That is austere, but not nihilistic. Nihilism would flatten values because no final ground secures them. Camus does not do that here. He refuses final ground, but he does not conclude that lived attachments are nothing. He simply will not let them pretend to be metaphysical guarantees. Their fragility is not an argument against them, it is part of their truth. This is where the video's question becomes sharper. Can we live without hope? If hope means every ordinary orientation toward tomorrow, probably not, and Camus does not need to claim we can. If hope means appeal, the metaphysical promise that the contradiction will be resolved by something beyond it, then Camus thinks we must live without it if the absurd is to remain honest. But must is not the same as can. Camus often writes as if lucidity were available to the person who chooses it. The harder question is whether a human being can sustain it without some hidden consolation creeping back in. We can admire the severity of without appeal and still wonder whether the mind is built to live there continuously. Camus does not leave without appeal as an abstract position. He wants to show what it looks like, how a person actually inhabits an absurd life, and the figures he uses are strange. Without appeal also changes the meaning of courage. Courage usually implies risk undertaken for some good. Camus's courage is stranger because the good is not guaranteed by any final order. The absurd person continues without knowing that continuation is cosmically endorsed. They do not receive the dignity of being on the right side of the universe. They act inside a world that withholds that category. Revolt, then, is not a mood of defiance that can be performed once. It is repeated maintenance. The absurd has to be kept alive against both despair and consolation. Despair says the silence makes life impossible. Consolation says the silence is not really silence. Revolt says the silence remains and life remains, and neither cancels the other. That is why revolt feels more like tension than triumph. Freedom without appeal also resists the modern slogan that we simply create our own meaning. Camus is sometimes recruited for that slogan, but it is too easy. If created meaning functions as a replacement final answer, it becomes another appeal, only now with the self playing God. Camus is more austere. We may create, choose, love and act, but we do not thereby solve the absurd. Passion is equally easy to soften. It does not mean chasing intensity as a lifestyle. The absurd person is not collecting experiences to prove they lived fully. That would still place life under a future judgment. Passion means inhabiting experience without postponing its value to a final explanation. It is the refusal to wait for permission from eternity before being present to a finite day. This makes without appeal both narrower and larger than it first seemed. Narrower because it does not dictate a detailed ethics or tell us what to do tomorrow morning. Larger because it changes the atmosphere in which everything is done. The same breakfast, walk, conversation, page or grief can be lived as appeal or without appeal, depending on whether it is asked to carry a final answer. Without appeal is not a posture of emotional dryness. It may require more feeling, not less, because there is no doctrine available to absorb the feeling into a final order. Grief has to be felt as grief. Love has to be felt as mortal. Joy has to be felt without being turned into evidence. This is one reason Camus can sound both severe and sensuous. The world is not less present because it lacks final justification. It may be more present because nothing is postponed beyond it. The phrase no appeal also clarifies why revolt cannot become a new religion of the self. If the self becomes the final source of meaning, appeal has only moved inward. Camus's absurd person does not enthrone the self as replacement God. The self is finite too, unstable too, destined for death too. Revolt is not self-deification, it is finite consciousness refusing both erasure and false eternity. The absurd life refuses both postponement and possession. It refuses postponement because no final future will arrive to make the present real. It refuses possession because nothing finite can be held forever. Between those refusals, a day can still be lived. That is the narrow region Camus is trying to defend. A finite present intense enough to inhabit, but not inflated into eternity. What would a person who genuinely lived without appeal look like? Not as a saint, not as a stoic. What would they actually do with their days? Here Camus becomes more unsettling than many readers expect. If he were writing a comforting philosophy, he might offer a wise figure, the compassionate friend, the artist healer, the ordinary person who finds meaning in small acts. Instead, he gives us figures like Don Juan, the actor, the conqueror, and the artist. They are not all admirable. That is part of the point. The common reading turns these figures into lifestyle models. Live intensely, love freely, create art, take action, refuse despair. But Camus is doing something more specific. He is not offering a list of people to imitate. He is testing what life without appeal might look like when the need for final justification has been removed. Take Don Juan. In ordinary moral terms, he is not an obvious hero. Camus is interested in him because he does not seek eternal love through one beloved. He loves in quantity, not because quantity is morally superior, but because it refuses to turn love into a path toward transcendence. This is uncomfortable. It should be. The example is philosophical, not pastoral. The actor gives another version. The actor lives many lives without claiming any of them as final. On stage, a life rises, burns, and disappears, then another. The actor's craft becomes an image of multiplicity without eternity. Again, Camus is not saying everyone should become an actor. He is showing a form of presence that does not ask experience to become permanent in order to matter. The Conqueror is the most dangerous example. Camus writes from a historical world where action, power, and violence cannot be treated innocently. We should not romanticize this figure. In the structure of the Myth of Sisyphus, the Conqueror represents action without appeal, a life spent in the field of history rather than under the promise of eternity. But this example has sharp edges, and later Camus's moral thought will complicate revolt much further. Then there is the artist. The artist seems safer at first, but perhaps is not. Art creates worlds. It gives shape, pattern, selection, memory. It can make suffering appear meaningful simply by arranging it. That makes art one of the most tempting places for hope to return under the cover of beauty. These figures share nothing except this. They do not require the world to provide the final word on whether what they are doing is justified. That is the absurd life. It is not a comfort. It can look cold, excessive, theatrical, even morally incomplete. Camus's point is not that these people are good. It is that they enact a relation to finitude. We tend to want our models to be lovable. We want the person who lives well without hope to be warm, generous, stable, fully human in the way we already admire. Camus's figures are often none of these things. That is not an accident. If the absurd life simply produced the virtues we already liked, the argument would be too easy. What makes the examples valuable is their refusal of depth as a promise. Don Juan does not claim love reveals eternity. The actor does not claim a role survives forever. The conqueror does not wait for history to justify action. The artist, at least in the absurd form, does not explain the world away. Each figure stays close to the surface. But surface here does not mean shallow. It means not smuggling in a beyond. This is one of Camus' most provocative inversions. We usually think depth lies behind appearances. The deeper truth, the hidden purpose, the final meaning beneath events. Camus suspects that this hunger for depth can become another appeal. The absurd life may require a fidelity to appearances. This face, this gesture, this morning, this act, this page, without converting them into evidence of another world. So the absurd life is not a program, it is a temperature. It is how experience is held. The same action can be lived with appeal or without it. Work can be a sacrifice offered to future redemption, or it can be work done inside a finite day. Love can be a proof that the universe is secretly good, or it can be love, vulnerable and unsponsored by eternity. That distinction is harder than it sounds, because we almost automatically seek backing. We want our choices underwritten. We want the things that matter to us to matter finally, not just to us. Camus's figures deny that underwriting. They show lives that burn without waiting to be certified by a higher meaning. But examples do not solve the psychological question. They show possibility in outline, not in guarantee. We may look at these figures and feel not liberated but uneasy. A life of quantity, roles, action and creation may still leave the 3 in the morning person asking whether anything adds up. Camus has not answered that person yet. There is one domain where the question of hope and the absurd becomes especially delicate, and that is art. Because art, more than almost anything else, has a tendency to sneak meaning back in through the side door. The examples also reveal a weakness in the book, or at least a historical distance. Camus's absurd figures are mostly male, stylized, and sometimes morally thin. A modern listener may not find them convincing as lives to admire. That reaction is useful. It reminds us that Camus is not giving saints. He is isolating a philosophical property, the absence of appeal. The examples can fail morally while still showing the structure he wants us to see. Don Juan, for instance, exposes the tension between quantity and depth. Camus privileges quantity because eternity has been removed, but we might ask whether a love without appeal must become a love without fidelity. The book does not fully answer that. Later Camus will care much more about limits, solidarity and measure. In the Myth of Sisyphus, the emphasis falls on consciousness and intensity, not yet on a complete moral account. The actor is perhaps the gentlest example because performance openly admits impermanence. A role exists for a time, then vanishes. No one expects the role to become eternal. The actor's life mirrors the absurd condition. Meaning appears in enactment, not in permanence. But again, the example is not advice. It is a lens for seeing how finite forms can matter without claiming metaphysical backing. The artist carries the most importance for the coming chapter because creation naturally tempts us toward rescue. To make form is already to choose, arrange, emphasize, and connect. The artist cannot avoid shaping the world. The question is whether that shaping becomes explanation. Can art show the world without secretly promising that the world has been redeemed by being shown beautifully? The unsettling quality of the examples may also keep the viewer from turning Camus into a comfort system. If the absurd life were represented only by noble kindness, it would be easy to assimilate it into existing moral hopes. Camus's strange figures resist that. They force us to ask whether living without appeal might change not only what we believe, but what kinds of lives become thinkable. The answer is not always reassuring. The examples are best heard as stress tests. What happens to love without eternity? What happens to action without final historical redemption? What happens to performance without permanence? What happens to creation without metaphysical depth? Camus runs these tests through stylized figures, and each figure reveals both the possibility and the insufficiency of absurd life when treated as a complete answer. What does art owe the question it opens? Does a novel that ends in silence owe us a resolution, or is the silence part of the answer? We often treat art as the humane alternative to metaphysics. If the universe gives no meaning, perhaps we make meaning through form. We write, paint, compose, perform, and gather fragments into patterns. This sounds like a perfect Camusian answer. No God required, no final doctrine required, just human creation under finite conditions. Camus is more cautious. Absurd creation, for him, must describe without explaining away. It should give us the density of experience without converting that density into a hidden solution. The absurd artist does not redeem the world by making it beautiful. The artist stays with the world's opacity and resists the temptation to smuggle transcendence back through pattern. This is why art is dangerous for the question of hope. Art can refuse explicit consolation and still make us feel consoled. A novel can end unresolved and yet leave us with the sense that the unresolved ending means something profound. A piece of music can offer no doctrine and still feel like reconciliation. Beauty has a way of making silence seem intentional. We have felt this. The work that does not explain itself but somehow feels like explanation. The image that withholds an answer so powerfully that the withholding becomes a kind of answer. Camus is asking whether that feeling is wisdom or whether it is the leak he has been tracking all along. Kafka becomes the crucial example. Many readers approach Kafka as an absurd writer almost by instinct. Opaque courts, unreachable castles, bureaucracies without clear centre, guilt without clear crime, search without conclusion. If absurd art means unresolved confrontation with a silent order, Kafka seems like the obvious master. Camus admires Kafka, but his reading is more complicated. He sees in Kafka a residue, a glimmer of hope. Not optimism, not a cheerful expectation that everything will work out. Something subtler, the sense that the castle may still have a key, that the trial may still have a hidden law, that the opacity may be organized by a meaning just out of reach. Let us be fair, this is Camus's reading of Kafka, not a settled verdict on Kafka. Kafka's work can be interpreted in many ways, and reducing it to a single theological remainder would be too simple. But for Camus's argument, the accusation matters because it shows how little hope is needed to change the structure of an absurd work. A glimmer is not a sunrise. It is not enough to light the room, but it is enough to suggest that light exists somewhere. That is the problem. If an artwork leaves us feeling that the nightmare has a hidden architecture, that the locked door has a rightful key, that the silence belongs to a system we cannot yet understand, then hope has returned as implication. Think of a novel, a film, or a piece of music that we found beautiful because it refused to resolve. Now ask, did we read something into that refusal? Did the very withholding feel like depth? Did the unanswered question become a sign that an answer existed beyond the frame? If yes, we have found Camus's glimmer of hope. Not in optimism, in serious beauty. We are better at reading ambiguity as depth than as emptiness. We treat unresolution as sophistication, as if the question left open is the author's way of pointing toward an answer we must find ourselves. Camus says this may be hope by another name. The work appears absurd, but the listener or reader converts its silence into meaning. This makes the question more uncomfortable. It is one thing to refuse an obvious consolation. It is another to discover consolation hiding inside our most austere forms of seriousness. The person who rejects motivational slogans may still find hope in ambiguity. The person who rejects metaphysics may still turn art into a metaphysical shelter. Absurd creation, then, has a nearly impossible discipline. It must create without redeeming creation. It must describe without pretending description explains. It must hold form without letting form become final meaning. Art cannot help making pattern. Camus asks whether pattern can remain faithful to the absurd instead of becoming a new appeal. This is not an argument against art. It is an argument for a more severe art. An art that refuses to console by secret arrangement. An art that lets the world appear with intensity, but does not promise that intensity is evidence of a hidden order. This is the artistic version of without appeal, and because art is so close to hope, the problem now looks even wider. Hope is not only in churches, doctrines, or metaphysical systems. It is in our reading habits, our desire for narrative, our need for endings, our tendency to treat beauty as proof that the silence is not empty. Hope is a structure of perception, so here is where we stand. We have followed hope from the 3 in the morning bedroom, through the philosophical leap, through the vocabulary of the absurd, through Camus's figures of how to live, and now into art, where hope can survive even in the most unresolved and serious creative work. What remains open is the hardest question. If hope is this pervasive, this structural, this able to persist even in Kafka's castle, is it possible to actually live without it? That is the question Camus answers with Sisyphus, and it is not the answer we expect. Kafka is powerful for Camus because his worlds seem to preserve the pressure of unanswered meaning. The characters search for entry, verdict, permission, or explanation. The systems around them behave as if meaning exists, but the meaning never becomes available. This is very close to the absurd relation. Demand, procedure, silence, repetition. The reader feels the hunger for a key more intensely because the key never arrives, but the very intensity of that hunger may become the problem. If the castle seems organized, if the court seems governed by a hidden law, then the silence is no longer pure silence. It is secrecy. Secrecy implies a secret implies an answer withheld. For Camus, this changes the metaphysics of the work. The inaccessible meaning may still be meaning, and that is enough for hope to enter. This distinction is fine, almost fragile, but it matters. An absurd artwork does not merely leave things unexplained. It prevents the unexplained from becoming an invitation to transcendence. It refuses to let mystery become theology by implication. It describes a world where explanation fails, but does not let failure itself become a clue that a higher explanation exists. We can feel how hard that is because interpretation is one of the ways we love art. We want patterns. We want echoes. We want the final image to illuminate the first image. We want the silence at the end to vibrate with hidden significance. In ordinary criticism, this is often the sign of greatness. In Camus's severe frame, it may also be the route by which hope returns. That does not mean we should stop loving Kafka or stop reading ambiguity deeply. It means Camus has identified a structure that exceeds religion. Hope survives wherever the mind treats withholding as proof of a withheld answer. The church is not the only place where appeal lives. It can live in art, criticism, memory, narrative, and the private way we arrange our own past into a story that feels destined. There is a second artistic temptation too, the temptation to let the audience provide the hope the artwork refuses to state. A work can remain silent, but the viewer may supply the hidden order. A story can deny closure, but the listener can experience the denial as a superior kind of closure. Camus's suspicion reaches beyond the author into reception. Hope is not only what a work says, it is also what we need the work to have meant. This is why the Kafka chapter belongs late in the video. By then, the viewer has learned to recognize appeal in its obvious forms. Kafka teaches us to recognize it in refined form. Hope can appear as a doctrinal claim, but it can also appear as the feeling that an unanswered question must have a hidden depth. The more sophisticated the viewer, the more likely this version may be. The more we notice this, the more difficult the word meaning becomes. Sometimes meaning means final justification. Sometimes it means pattern. Sometimes it means felt significance. Camus's suspicion is mostly aimed at the first, but the first can hide inside the others. A pattern can begin as form and become justification. A feeling of significance can begin as attention and become appeal. Art lives on that border. There is one last tension to keep visible before Sisyphus arrives. Camus's argument depends on a kind of loyalty to the present that can look almost impossible from inside ordinary life. We are creatures of memory and anticipation. We do not simply stand in the day, we carry the past forward and pull the future backward into every decision. Hope enters through that structure. It says the future may repair the past. Camus asks what happens if the future is allowed to arrive only as future, not as redemption. That does not make the present simple. The present is full of absence, expectation, memory, and unfinished grief. Living without appeal does not mean living in a clean instant, cut off from everything before and after. It means refusing to let before and after become a hidden court that will finally justify the instant. The day remains connected to other days. It simply stops being evidence in a trial whose verdict has been promised elsewhere. This is where the argument becomes most demanding for the listener. It does not ask us to stop caring about outcomes. It asks us not to confuse outcomes with final meaning. It does not ask us to stop loving the dead. It asks us not to turn love into proof that death is secretly defeated. It does not ask us to stop hoping tomorrow may be better. It asks us not to make tomorrow responsible for redeeming the whole of yesterday. What would it mean to be happy without being rescued? Not happy because things worked out. Happy at the moment when the full situation is visible and nothing has changed. The famous line has become almost too familiar to hear. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. It appears on posters, in short videos, in captions about hard work. in arguments about finding meaning in the grind. But in Camus, the sentence is not an inspirational motto. It is the final pressure point of the argument. Sisyphus is punished by the gods. He pushes a stone up a mountain. The stone rolls back. He descends. He pushes again. Nothing accumulates. Nothing improves. No progress is stored. The task is not difficult on the way to success. It is difficult precisely because success has been structurally removed. This is where the phrase from the beginning returns. We wanted life to add up to something. Sisyphus's task does not add up. The repetitions do not become a monument. The effort does not compound into achievement. The stone reaches the top only to fall. If there is a figure who should destroy the arithmetic of hope, it is Sisyphus. And yet Camus says we must imagine him happy. Let us read that as a philosophical claim, not as consolation. The happiness is not in the stone staying at the top. It does not. The happiness is not in Sisyphus finding a hidden purpose assigned by the gods. There is none. The happiness is not in pretending the task is other than futile. Camus needs the futility to remain intact. The decisive moment is the descent. When Sisyphus walks back down the mountain, the stone is not in his hands. The labour has paused. Consciousness returns. He sees the full shape of his fate. He knows what has happened and what will happen again. For Camus, this consciousness is where superiority begins. The punishment depends on futility. Consciousness makes the futility visible and no longer secretly sovereign. This is a strange kind of victory. Nothing external changes. The gods are not defeated in the ordinary sense. The stone is still there. The mountain is still there. The cycle remains. But Sisyphus knows. He does not add hope to the situation. He does not imagine a final ascent where the stone stays. He possesses his fate by seeing it without appeal. We want Sisyphus to feel better than he should. We want the descent to have dignity because it is building towards something. Camus's difficult move is to say the dignity is real and requires nothing to be building. That is not easier to accept because he says it beautifully. It may be the hardest claim in the book. There is scorn in Camus's Sisyphus. Not bitterness exactly. Scorn as a refusal to be inwardly owned by the punishment. The gods can impose the task, but they cannot force Sisyphus to interpret the task as they intend. If he knows the whole extent of his condition and still descends toward the stone, then consciousness has become a form of revolt. Again, this is not optimism. Optimism expects improvement. Sisyphus expects repetition. This is not resilience in the usual therapeutic sense. Resilience often imagines recovery. Sisyphus does not recover from the mountain. This is not meaning-making in the soft modern sense. He does not create a private meaning that cancels the futility. The futility is the condition of the claim. So what is happiness doing here? Camus may be stretching the word until it almost breaks. Happiness here is not satisfaction, relief, joy, comfort, or reward. It is something like lucid possession of a fate that cannot be escaped. It is the absence of inner appeal at the exact point where appeal would be most understandable. We have probably had small versions of this, though never in mythic purity. A moment inside difficulty where relief does not arrive, but clarity does. The situation is not solved, the loss is not repaired, the future is not guaranteed. And yet there is a strange steadiness in seeing the thing without bargaining with it. Camus calls this happiness. We may hesitate to follow him that far. That hesitation matters. If we accept the line too easily, we turn it into the very consolation Camus has been trying to resist. We say, even the futile life can be happy, so everything is fine. But everything is not fine in the myth. The stone returns. The punishment remains. The gods have not apologized. The world has not answered. The more honest reading is that Camus has changed the question. He has not shown that life will satisfy the hope we began with. He has shown a form of consciousness that does not need that hope in order to continue. That is less comforting and more radical. The 3 in the morning person wanted a sign that everything would add up. Sisyphus receives no sign. He descends anyway. But even here, a doubt remains. Is calling Sisyphus happy already a glimmer of hope? Has Camus, after refusing every appeal, smuggled in a final consolation through the word happiness. Perhaps. Or perhaps he is deliberately forcing happiness to mean something stripped of appeal, something almost unrecognizable from the outside. The answer is not obvious. That is why the ending endures. It does not give us a doctrine we can comfortably apply. It leaves us with an image, a man, a stone, a mountain, a descent, a consciousness that knows there will be no final rescue and yet does not collapse. We are asked to imagine happiness there, and the difficulty of imagining it is part of the point. So we arrive where Camus intended to leave us, not with an answer that resolves hope, but with a position, and a set of questions the position does not resolve. That is where the final distinction begins. The descent is important because it is the only interval in the punishment where consciousness can fully collect itself. During the ascent, the body is absorbed in effort. The stone demands force, attention, breath. At the top, the result is lost almost immediately. On the way down, Sisyphus has time to know. He sees the whole cycle. The knowledge does not free him externally, but it changes the inward relation to fate. Camus's claim that fate becomes a human matter must be heard carefully. It does not mean Sisyphus chose the punishment or that he can reinterpret it however he likes. It means the gods do not possess the final interpretation of what they have imposed. Consciousness introduces a distance between suffering and submission. Sisyphus can know the punishment as punishment and still refuse to be spiritually reduced to it. The famous happiness depends on no lie. If Sisyphus secretly believed the stone would one day stay, the image would collapse back into hope. If he discovered the gods had a plan for his improvement, the absurd would disappear. If he found a hidden cosmic meaning in the mountain, the punishment would be redeemed. Camus allows none of this. The happiness has to occur with the futility fully intact. This is why the poster version is so damaging. Find meaning in the struggle is not exactly Camus's conclusion. The struggle is not secretly meaningful because we decide to like it. Rather, the struggle is enough to fill a heart when consciousness refuses appeal. That is a stranger claim. It does not make the mountain kind. It says the human being can be present to the mountain without asking kindness from it. And yet the doubt about consolation remains honest. The word happy may be doing more work than Camus admits. It may give the reader a final warmth after a book of refusals. It may be the smallest possible appeal, not to God or transcendence, but to a human need for the story to end with affirmation. If so, Camus is not outside the problem. He is inside it with us. The mountain also strips away comparison. Sisyphus cannot console himself by saying the task is useful to someone else. He cannot imagine a community benefiting from his labor. He cannot say the repetition trains his character for a future trial. The punishment is closed on itself. That closure is why the happiness, if we can call it happiness, has to come from consciousness alone. Nothing external is available to rescue the scene from futility. The descent also returns us to time. Sisyphus does not live in the final moment when all is revealed. He lives in repetition. The absurd life is not a single heroic insight, but the renewal of lucidity across recurrence. The stone will fall again. Consciousness must return again. Revolt is not achieved once. It is walked back down the mountain every time. Sisyphus also forces us to separate dignity from outcome. In ordinary life, we often let outcome decide whether effort was dignified. If the stone stays, the labor was worth it. If it falls, the labor was wasted. Camus breaks that equation. The stone falls, and the question of dignity remains open. His answer is consciousness. Whether we can accept that answer is the final test of the book. This also protects the question from becoming decorative. Hope is not an abstract theme placed over Camus like atmosphere. It is the pressure that tests every stage of the argument. If hope enters too early, the absurd dissolves. If hope is rejected too crudely, the human being disappears. Camus's difficulty is keeping both dangers visible at once. The reason this matters is that Camus is easy to make safer than he is. We can turn revolt into resilience, lucidity into mindfulness, Sisyphus into a work ethic, and without appeal into a stylish way of saying we should keep going. Each translation removes the edge. The edge is that Camus refuses to let continuation become reassurance. He wants us to ask whether continuing can remain honest when it is not backed by any final promise. So the script has to keep returning to the same pressure without merely repeating it. Hope is tender, hope is dangerous, hope is ordinary, hope is metaphysical. Hope can keep a human being in time, and hope can erase the very confrontation Camus wants preserved. The argument lives in that double vision. That double vision is the whole burden of the video, and it is why the question remains alive after the explanation is complete. Is hope one thing, or are two different things using the same word? And does the difference make Camus's position more livable, or only more complicated? The danger now is to say Camus is against hope. That is too blunt. It would make the argument sound cruel and false to ordinary life. People hope for children to recover, for friends to return, for work to matter, for tomorrow to be kinder than today. Camus's target is not every forward movement of the heart. His target is hope as appeal. Let us be precise about what he is and is not refusing. He refuses the hope that says the absurd will be reconciled by a final meaning. He refuses the hope that says the silence is secretly speech. He refuses the hope that says suffering is guaranteed a metaphysical compensation. He refuses the leap that preserves life by sacrificing lucidity. But ordinary endurance is not automatically that. To hope that tomorrow's conversation goes better is not the same as hoping the universe is on our side. To plant a tree is not necessarily to believe history has a final moral arc. To love someone is not necessarily to claim love is secured by eternity. These ordinary hopes may live inside the absurd without dissolving it. The difficulty is that the two forms mingle. We are built for both kinds of hope at once. We cannot always tell them apart in the moment. A practical hope can quietly become a metaphysical hope when the stakes become high enough. We begin by hoping tomorrow is better. We end by needing tomorrow to prove that yesterday was not meaningless. Imagine two people awake at 3 in the morning. The first is hoping for a sign, something that says their life has been worth it, that the suffering has been heard, that the effort will compound into something final. The second is simply hoping tomorrow is less painful than today, and does not mean by that any cosmic claim. Camus's argument is not aimed at the second person, but it asks how often, in the honest dark, we remain the second person. That is the discipline of lucidity, not the absence of hope in every ordinary sense, but the ability to notice when hope has changed jobs, when it has stopped helping us continue and started promising that continuation will be finally justified, when it has stopped opening tomorrow and started rewriting the nature of the world. This distinction also protects Camus from becoming anti-human. A life without any expectation, affection, or practical hope would not be a lucid life. It would be a damaged one. We are temporal beings. We live by projecting ourselves into the next hour, the next meal, the next conversation, the next season. Camus does not need to deny that to make his argument. But the distinction also prevents us from domesticating him. We cannot say Camus only rejects false hope and then proceed to keep every consolation we already liked. The hope he refuses may be woven deeply into our ordinary ways of making pain bearable. The fact that a hope is human does not mean it is faithful to the absurd. So the final question is not simply can we live without hope? It is, can we live with ordinary hope while refusing metaphysical appeal? Can we make plans without asking time to justify us? Can we love without asking love to defeat death? Can we suffer without deciding suffering must be redeemed somewhere beyond suffering? Camus seems to think this is possible, at least as a discipline. Revolt does not abolish tenderness, it abolishes appeal. It keeps us inside the world, inside the day, inside the finite relation between consciousness and silence. It lets us continue without turning continuation into proof. Whether this is psychologically sustainable is another question. Camus's prose can make lucidity sound like a stance one takes. But anyone who has lived through grief knows lucidity comes and goes. We bargain, we appeal, we renounce appeal, and then appeal again. The mind reaches for hidden meanings with a speed philosophy cannot always govern. This does not refute Camus. It may make him more serious. If lucidity were easy, it would not need a book. If living without appeal were natural, we would not keep inventing appeals. The difficulty of Camus's position is evidence of the problem he is naming. Hope returns because the demand returns, so the two faces of hope remain in us. One helps us wake tomorrow. The other asks tomorrow to redeem everything. One belongs to finite life. The other tries to escape finitude. One can sit beside revolt. The other ends revolt by promising that the confrontation is not final after all. And this is where the argument stops being an interpretation of Camus and becomes a question we have to carry. Not as life advice, not as a command to give up hope, as a distinction that will arrive again whenever the world does not answer and we feel the old wish to make its silence mean something. The closing is not where the argument ends, it is where we face what the argument has left standing. One more pressure point belongs here. Camus is not trying to win a debate by making the alternatives look foolish. The force of the argument depends on the alternatives remaining attractive. If hope were obviously childish, lucidity would be easy. The problem is that hope often appears at its most persuasive when it is most philosophically dangerous, when it protects love, dignifies grief, and gives language to the part of us that cannot bear a mute world. This is why the argument has to stay source-led rather than mood-led. The myth of Sisyphus is not a general meditation on feeling lost. It is a sequence of refusals. First, refuse the conclusion that absurdity requires death. Then refuse the leap that turns absurdity into transcendence. Then ask what kind of life remains when both refusals are kept in view. Hope matters because it tests the second refusal again and again. There is also a humility built into the problem. Camus can describe lucidity, but description is not possession. We can understand the difference between endurance and appeal in language, and still fail to hold it in experience. That failure does not make the distinction useless, it makes the distinction more exact. It gives us a way to notice the moment when the mind begins changing silence into promise. The channel of escape is often small. A phrase, an image, a story about how things were meant to be. We may not even believe it fully. We may only lean on it for a few seconds. But those seconds reveal the structure Camus is worried about. They show how quickly the human demand for meaning searches for another court, another horizon, another voice willing to say what the world has not said. Against that movement, revolt is not loud. It is quieter than rebellion usually sounds. It is the continued act of not converting the wound into a guarantee. It is returning to the day without pretending the day has been authorized by eternity. It is allowing finite things to matter finitely, which may be more difficult than making them matter forever. The question of how revolt and love coexist is not answered by simply separating them. Camus does not say, be cold and you will be honest. He says, be present to things without converting presence into proof. These are different instructions. The first would forbid tenderness. The second allows it, but changes what tenderness asks for. A parent sitting beside a sick child does not need to believe the universe is watching in order to sit. The sitting is already a form of care that does not require metaphysical backing. The child does not need the parent to have cosmic assurance. The child needs the parent to remain. Revolt in this image is not the absence of love, but the refusal to demand that love be cosmically guaranteed. The care is real. The universe has not weighed in. This is a difficult place to stay. The natural motion, especially in extremity, is to reach further. Not just to hope the child recovers, but to need recovery to mean something beyond the room. To need it to say that care was heard by something larger, that the vigil was noticed. The word for that further motion, in Camus's vocabulary, is appeal. And the movement is nearly automatic. It does not feel like philosophy. It feels like love going to its full extent. Camus does not mock that movement. He traces it. He shows how it arises from the same root as everything else he has been examining. The human demand for meaning when meaning is not guaranteed. The demand is not a symptom of weakness. It is a symptom of consciousness itself. We are the kind of beings who cannot be present without asking. That asking is what the absurd describes. Hope as appeal is the attempt to answer before the answer has arrived. The discipline Camus asks for is the discipline of holding the question open, not finding a private answer and hiding it from oneself, not saying the universe is silent and then listening anyway for a familiar voice. The open question is not comfortable. It does not tell us what our suffering was for. It only asks us to remain in the room with what is actually there, rather than the room we are wishing into existence. There is a form of hope that survives this. It is not smaller in feeling, only more limited in what it claims. We can hope for the child to recover without claiming recovery as divinely owed. We can hope for the work to matter without claiming history as building toward a final justification of our effort. We can hope for the next hour to be bearable without deciding the next hour will prove anything about the nature of time. That limited hope is continuous with life. The larger hope, the hope that asks the universe to confirm the significance of what we are living through, is the one Camus follows and refuses. The problem is not identifying the distinction in calm analysis. The problem is holding it when the argument from need arrives. The argument from need says, if this mattered, something should acknowledge it. If love is real, death should not be allowed to be its end. If the effort was genuine, something should remember. The argument is not stupid. It is the most human argument there is. Camus does not answer it with a better argument. He answers it with a position. The argument from need does not establish the conclusion. The need is real. The claim based on the need is not verified by the need's intensity. This is the austerity that costs something. Not the austerity of feeling less, but the austerity of refusing to let feeling legislate reality. The grief that does not produce a hidden design is still real grief. The love that does not defeat death is still real love. The effort that does not get cosmically recorded is still real effort. Lucidity is not the claim that nothing matters. It is the claim that things can matter without the universe mattering back. That phrase, things can matter without the universe mattering back. It may be the most direct way to say what Camus is working toward in all those pages on absurdity and revolt. The absurd is not the discovery that life is worthless. It is the discovery that life's worth is not confirmed by anything outside life. The demand for external confirmation is the appeal. Revolt is the life that continues without waiting for the confirmation. We should not make revolt sound easy to sustain. Camus's own life resisted simple categories. He wrote about absurdity while loving people fiercely. He wrote about revolt while caring intensely whether injustice was answered. He was not a man performing emotional vacancy. The demand to care, to love, to want justice satisfied ran through him as strongly as the refusal of easy consolations. The argument of the myth of Sisyphus does not claim that living without appeal is restful. It claims that living without appeal is possible, and that it preserves something ordinary consolation loses. What it preserves is contact with the actual. When we insert a hidden meaning into a situation, we stop seeing the situation and start seeing the meaning we have projected. The sick child becomes evidence of a cosmos that tests love. The death becomes proof of an afterlife that vindicates the love. The grief becomes a message about the nature of sacrifice. Each of these moves is a form of comfort that costs the actual. Camus wants us to keep contact with the actual at the price of comfort. That price is real. The actual is the child's face, the silence after the last breath, the continuation of one's own breathing when the room is no longer shared. No projected meaning makes that actual less severe. What revolt offers is not a replacement for the severity. It offers a way of remaining present to it without letting the severity force an exit into consolation. The exit is understandable. Revolt says only, notice when you are taking it and understand what you are choosing when you do. The distinction between the two hopes, then, is not finally a philosophical distinction. It is a distinction between two ways of being present to one's own life. One way asks life to confirm itself by pointing beyond itself. The other stays inside the life that is actually here. Both ways are human. Only one is honest about what the situation actually contains. This is why the final pages of the Myth of Sisyphus do not read like a proof. They read like a description of someone returning from a long philosophical journey and looking at a boulder and a mountain. The journey has not changed the boulder. The mountain is still there. Sisyphus is still condemned. What has changed is that the interpretive overlay has been removed. He is not serving a cosmic lesson. He is not being refined by repetition. He is not secretly part of a larger story. He is pushing a stone, and the pushing is what there is, and Camus asks us to imagine that being enough. Not enough in the consoled sense. Enough in the sense of, this is what existence offers when the appeal has fallen away, and the person is still here, still pushing, still descending, still returning. There is also a test this image quietly administers. If we read that final picture and feel immediate relief, as though the stone and the mountain had been secretly made comfortable, we have probably imported a consolation Camus did not put there. The image should remain uncomfortable. If Sisyphus is happy, the happiness is not the happiness of release. It is the happiness, if we can hold that word, of full presence to a situation that offers nothing beyond itself. The test is whether we can hear that without softening it, without reaching for a warmer interpretation that returns appeal through the back door. Camus leaves the image open because the openness is the point. If the ending was settled, the argument would be over. The fact that we keep asking whether Sisyphus is really happy, whether the happiness is real or only claimed, whether Camus has earned the final word or smuggled it in, is part of what the book does. It keeps the pressure alive. It keeps the question returning. It makes us descend again. And that returning is not failure. It is not evidence that the argument has not worked. The argument was never meant to resolve the demand. It was meant to make the demand visible, so we could see it arriving and know what we were doing when we either resisted it or gave in. That visibility is not comfort, but it is something. It is the difference between being moved without knowing you are being moved, and watching the movement happen with open eyes. Whether we can call that happiness is the question we carry after the book is closed. The distinction between the two hopes should not become an easy sorting system. In real life, we rarely know which hope is operating until pressure reveals it. A plan can be practical for months, then become metaphysical in a single night. A love can be finite and honest, then suddenly asked to prove that death is not final. Lucidity is not a label we attach to hopes from a distance. It is the work of noticing their transformation. This also means Camus's position is not permission for emotional austerity toward other people. We do not answer another person's ordinary hope with a lecture on appeal. Philosophy becomes cruel when it forgets timing, relation, and care. Camus's argument is a discipline of one's own lucidity before it is a weapon against someone else's consolation. The script has to preserve that boundary, or it becomes exactly the cold performance the channel should avoid. At the same time, the ordinary kindness of hope cannot be used to protect every metaphysical comfort from examination. The fact that a belief consoles does not make it false, but neither does consolation make it true. Camus's austerity lies in refusing to let need decide ontology. We may need the world to answer. The need is real, the answer is not thereby established. The final form of the question might be this: can we let finite things be finite and still love them? Can we let tomorrow be tomorrow, not redemption? Can we let grief be grief, not proof of a hidden design? Can we let joy appear without forcing it to testify for the universe? If we can, even briefly, we have touched the region Camus calls revolt. The closing must leave the pressure intact because the pressure is the inheritance of the book. A neat answer would betray the path we have followed. If we say hope is bad, we flatten the tenderness that made the question worth asking. If we say hope is fine as long as it helps, we lose Camus's severe insight into appeal. The truthful ending stands between those simplifications and refuses both. What remains is not a method but a vigilance. Watch the moment when tomorrow becomes redemption. Watch the moment when beauty becomes proof. Watch the moment when grief becomes a message, because grief without message feels unbearable. These are not sins, they are human movements. Camus asks whether we can see them as movements, rather than mistaking them for answers. The final distinction also changes how we read the famous line, If one must imagine Sisyphus happy, perhaps the happiness is not a feeling added to futility, but the name Camus gives to life when appeal has fallen away and ordinary continuation remains. Sisyphus does not hope the stone will stay, but he still descends, he still returns, he still inhabits the next moment. That continuation is not metaphysical hope. It is the stubborn fact revolt preserves. This is why the episode should not end by telling us to live without hope. That sentence would be too blunt to be true. A better ending is more difficult. Learn to hear what kind of hope is speaking. The hope that opens tomorrow may belong to life. The hope that turns silence into promise may belong to escape. Camus does not remove the need to distinguish them. He makes the distinction impossible to unsee. The ordinary hope that remains compatible with Camus may be smaller than we want. It does not say history will vindicate us. It does not say love defeats death. It does not say the wound was necessary. It says only that we are still in time, that tomorrow is not yet here, and that finite action remains possible. That smallness may be precisely what keeps it honest. The stone is not a symbol of triumph. It is a symbol of the question's return. Every time we think we have settled the distinction between endurance and appeal, life gives us another descent, another silence, another chance to turn the silence into promise, or to let it remain silence and continue anyway. Camus's demand is not that we solve this once, it is that we notice when the old escape becomes beautiful again. This is why the question cannot be settled by vocabulary alone. We can say without appeal and still appeal secretly. We can say revolt and still hope the revolt will be rewarded. We can say lucidity and still use lucidity as a self-image that protects us from fear. Camus's terms are not magic. They have to be inhabited, and the inhabiting is where the difficulty begins, and perhaps that is why Camus remains useful precisely when he is not comforting. He does not give the right viewer a slogan. He gives the right viewer a sharper ear for consolation. After him, hope can no longer be an innocent word. It may still be necessary. It may still be tender. But it must now answer a question it did not have to answer before. Am I helping life continue, or am I making the silence speak? The question we began with was simple enough to fit in the dark. Can we live without hope? But Camus has made the word harder. Hope is not one thing. It can be the ordinary human leaning toward tomorrow, the small practical trust that lets a day continue. And it can be appeal, the demand that somewhere beyond the silence there is a final answer making the silence bearable. Camus's refusal is aimed at the second form. He is not asking us to become inhuman. He is asking whether we can remain faithful to what the absurd reveals, that we ask for meaning, and the world does not give it back in the form we want. To live without appeal is to keep that confrontation open, without killing the person who asks, and without inventing the answer the world has not given. That is not inspiration, it is a discipline, and it is not a discipline we possess once and keep. The distinction between the hope that endures and the hope that escapes has to be made again in each hard moment. We can know the difference clearly at noon and lose it completely at 3 in the morning, when the old need returns and the ceiling gives back nothing. The person from the opening is still there. The stone is still rolling back. The wish that everything will add up to something has not vanished just because Camus has named it. If anything, the wish has become more visible. We can now see when it asks for tomorrow, and when it asks for metaphysical rescue. We can see when it keeps us alive, and when it quietly asks us to stop seeing. Sisyphus does not answer that wish by satisfying it. The stone does not add up. The descent does not become progress. The punishment remains punishment. If he is happy, his happiness is not the happiness of being rescued. It is the impossible happiness of consciousness without appeal, a happiness so severe that we may wonder whether the word still belongs. And perhaps that is the final honesty Camus leaves us with. Maybe one must imagine Sisyphus happy, or maybe that sentence is Camus's own glimmer of hope, the one small light he allows himself after refusing every other light. The question does not destroy the argument, it keeps it awake. It reminds us that even the philosophy of lucidity has to watch itself for consolation. so can we live without hope? If hope means the ordinary movement toward tomorrow, probably not, and perhaps we should not try. If hope means appeal, the promise that the world will finally explain itself, that suffering will be reconciled by a meaning beyond suffering, that the stone is secretly building something, Camus's answer is harsher. We can live only by refusing that appeal, or we are no longer living the absurd honestly. The harder question is whether we can keep the refusal, not for one clear hour, but through love, grief, labor, illness, and the long repetitions of ordinary life. Camus gives us no guarantee. He gives us an image and a demand: the descent, the stone, the open-eyed return, the refusal to let silence become a hidden voice. If tonight's question is sitting with us, if we are asking what remains when both despair and consolation are refused, the next place this investigation goes is Kierkegaard, who makes the opposite move with the same raw material. He stands at the same edge and leaps. Camus stands there and refuses. Between them is one of the deepest arguments about what a human being is allowed to hope for.